Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the 1 to 10 podcast. We're back with a new series. We've had a bit of an extended break, but hopefully for our kind of loyal listeners, you'll notice a slight change of scenery behind me. Today's topic is something that's growing in importance within our industry, and also something that I've personally had to kind of encounter in my own life. Is the topic of neurodiversity. And to help me discuss that today is Dr. Elizabeth, who is a psychologist and coach with respect to all matters around mental health and neurodiversity. You also spend a fair amount of time advising people on how to deal with Gen Z and millennials. Yep. So welcome to the show and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Be useful just for the audience to understand a bit more about your background and what you do in your areas of focus.
Sure. So I wear three different hats mainly, I would say. By profession, I am a counselling psychologist and psychotherapist, and I work in practice in clinic. I work with individuals in a range of different areas around mental health, ranging from anxiety, depression, to more harmful behaviours, trauma, so on and so forth. I also am a big believer in mental health education and run some mental health education programs across schools and other such areas, more community-based. And then this third area, really, which links to why we're here today, is working more in the corporate world and having a think about how to bridge gaps, optimize potential, maximize performance, get the most out of people at work, and bringing the psychological tools that I use on a daily basis in my work to the corporate world.
Brilliant. Okay. For, I guess, our listeners that would be interested in understanding your journey and how you got to this, would you mind sharing, I guess, your pathway to this point currently?
Sure. So I suppose if we go back, my background in my studies was my undergrad and my master's were at Cambridge, looking at all things around education, psychology, and history, actually, all different areas of society. I then went on to study my doctorate to become a psychologist and did placements in a range of settings, from rehab centres to prison to general counselling centres, working with people at risk in different communities. So whilst I was working in prison, actually, I was working with quite a lot of millennial offenders, I mean all ages, and they were really tricky and challenging. And I was talking to somebody that I knew personally, who was the CEO of a company, and he was complaining to me about all these millennials in his office at work, saying these millennials, they're so difficult to motivate, they're so difficult to retain, they keep leaving and they're always late and they just don't dress properly. And I said, oh, have you tried doing this and have you tried saying it like that? He said, you really don't understand how difficult these people are. And I was working at prison at the time, so I was working with some really difficult people. So I was like, I might understand a bit about, difficult people. He said, okay, well, if you know so well, why don't you come in and run a training for my managers, because we don't know what to do with them. So I said, sure, no problem. So I went in, ran a training, and it just went really well. And actually, people really enjoyed it, and things that to me were so straightforward and things that I just did every day were things that were really helpful for people to hear in the workplace, of how to engage people of different ages, of different backgrounds. Yep. And as time has passed, I suppose neurodiversity, again, it's something I've always worked with. Being a psychologist, of course, it's part of the job. And there has been a growing interest, particularly over the last few years in the workplace, around this area. More and more companies are talking about it, and I'm so pleased they are, because I really see from underneath the surface inside my work how much it impacts people on a day-to-day basis. Yep. And so started running workshops and informing people actually about the background of what neurodiversity really is. People seem to throw around all these terms, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, autism, but people actually don't know what they mean, what they are, what's okay to say, what's not. Yep. So I've been running workshops around that area more and more recently.
Brilliant. And I guess for listeners that, and I'm coming from a place where up until probably a year, and we discussed this, right, where the term was used and I'm sat in a meeting and nodding my head, but really I'm thinking, what does this mean? So
What is it? Yeah.
for people out there that don't necessarily understand or aren't familiar with the term, how would you define neurodiversity?
Yeah, and that's the most important question, is to just start by asking and being curious. Because there are a lot of people, I think, nowadays who are sitting in meetings and neurodiversity is brought up, and you've got a lot of really passionate people. It's like, yeah. Afterwards, like, Google, what is neurodiversity? And neurodiversity is basically just that different people's brains work in different ways.
Right.
It's as simple as that. All of our brains work differently. There are a few key features that come up in the workplace. So neurodivergent individuals would be people whose brains are working not according to the statistical norm. And 4 of the main neurodivergent diagnoses that we find in the workplace are dyslexia, which most people have heard of, but still a lot of people don't really understand. They just think, oh, it means I can't spell, or I can't really read properly, or find it hard. But it's a little more complicated than that. Dyspraxia, ADHD, and ASD, autism. I can give a quick definition of each one if that's helpful.
Yep, no, absolutely, yep.
So dyslexia relates more to processing, thinking about things like reading, spelling, but also speaking, retaining information, so memory, short-term memory, and recalling and retrieving information. It is more of a language-based form of neurodiversity. Then we have dyspraxia, which is to do with, it's a disruption of communication from the brain to the body. So it might be that it can relate to where I am placed in the physical world, that I might misjudge where things are, so I might knock into things, but it also could relate to my language and my communication. So I might say things in a different order, or hear what you're saying in a different type of order. And then we have ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are 3 main characteristics of that. So that would be hyperactivity, which is not just bouncing off the walls, as people kind of imagine a really hyper little boy. It could also be a hyper focus on something. Right. So hyperactivity might be, if I'm into something, I'm really zoned in and I can't even hear anything else. So if I'm reading an important email, for example, or I'm working on an important deal, I can't actually do anything else because I'm so pulled into it. But then there's also distractibility is a feature. So a really high sense of distractibility, that it's quite hard for me to focus on something. But then if it catches my focus, I'm super focused. So impulse, and I think that comes up quite a lot in the funds world.
Yep.
Impulsivity is just, I don't take a minute to think before I do or think, before I do or say. I just do or say, and it can end up with some backlash. There's a risk. It can also end up in massive reward, but it's just this strong sense of impulsivity. And then there's autism, which relates to things to do with social skills, giving over communication, receiving communication, perhaps also being stuck in particular habits or behaviours, and also sensory sensitivities. So pretty wide-ranging. They're all really different, but they actually all really overlap as well. There are features that are common between all of them. And one of the most important commonalities is that they all are spectrums, which means that they all present differently in each person. So whilst there are commonalities, what's important to remember is obviously humans are much more than labels. And there are also big nuances between how each person might manifest some of these forms of neurodiversity.
Yeah. Just going back on that, so we've talked about certain characteristics. I'm sure, like, I'm sat here listening to you list those, and I'm kind of almost thinking, oh, I do that, and I'm sure there will be others who, aren't necessarily, for want of a better phrase, labelled with one of those conditions, but can certainly relate to that. So I guess do you feel like most people in some shape or form display some of these tendencies in today's world?
It's a really great question. And the point is neurodiversity, there are neurodivergent individuals who might have a particular diagnosis or particularly more manifestations of particular areas of neurodiversity. But absolutely, we're all different in how we work. And there will be people that have manifestations from all of these spectrums, some of these spectrums. And then there'll also be some people who might be diagnosed with one particular form of neurodiversity, but they also have manifestations. It's quite common to also have manifestations from other forms of neurodiversity too. Diagnosis is actually a really important question, the label, the term, because people can absolutely have these manifestations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they warrant or need a diagnosis or a label. And overall, I would say there are two main reasons really, I think, when labels can be helpful. They sometimes can be unhelpful. They can lead to judgment, generalizations, but they can be really helpful for two main reasons, I'd say. First of all is access to support. So if someone has a label, they can access perhaps medications, if they're still in school or doing exams and studying, access arrangements for those studies, extra support for whatever it is that they need, wherever they're at. And the other is a bit more nuanced, but it's super, super important, is the comfort and understanding that it brings to the individual. To go through life feeling like I'm so different, but I don't understand why, can lead to feeling quite unsettled. And sometimes a label can give some reassurance and validation to, oh, I'm not weird, I'm not bad, I'm just this, I'm just ADHD, or I'm just dyslexic. And what we know about each of these forms of neurodiversity is they're not reflections of socioeconomic status, of intelligence. They are just a different way of the brain working. So if somebody, for example, goes through school dyslexic but is never labelled, they might be branded as stupid, because they can't spell the word beautiful. Who can spell beautiful? It's got an E, an A and a U all together. Who does that in the word beautiful? It does make sense, especially not to the dyslexic brain. But they can never spell it, so they might be branded as not capable, but they could be super, super smart. Apparently Einstein was dyslexic. Right. You don't need to spell, So I suppose a really powerful sentence that I often use in my practice is, somebody who is not labelled that needs a label can be mislabelled. Whether it's as stupid or ADHD, it could be as disruptive, it could be rude, if it's to do with autism, social skills. So there's a place for labels, but not everyone needs labels, and they can still have manifestations of these things.
Absolutely. Let's talk about your practice. So one of the hats you wear is going into the corporate world and I guess working with clients on raising awareness around some of these topics. I appreciate the focus is on neurodiversity, but we can cover the broader range. How have you found, I guess, within the corporate world, how has the attitude been towards, okay, we need to have measures in place, or we need to have support mechanisms for people that maybe kind of have some kind of diagnosis or be labelled in some way?
Different industries are up to different places with this. As a generalisation, I would say, often it is the younger industries that tend to be more flexible, more aware of diversity and inclusions, and might be more clued up in these areas, such as the tech world or the startup world. The more traditional industries, if I may say, sometimes can be a little bit more stuck in their ways, and change needs to be spoken about for a really long time before it kind of trickles down to practice. So I definitely think that conversation now is happening everywhere, which is great. How much is being implemented, I think, is really ranging from firm to firm, company to company, and it's something that that all come, I would say all industries are now on a journey, but they're not all down to implementing change. A lot of the more traditional ones are still very much in the phase of raising awareness. Let's talk about this.
Yep. With that then, how would you say, what is the best way to address neurodiversity? What are the key questions to be asked?
Yeah.
What kind of language should we be using or not using?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts around?
Absolutely. I think that with all forms of diversity, when we want to raise awareness, we need to start with education. So I think that running educational sessions, I know that I run quite a lot of them, where I'll speak to lots and lots of people within a company and say, similar to what I'm saying to you here, this is what neurodiversity is.
Yep.
This is what dyslexia is. This is what ADHD is. This is what autism is. This is how it could impact a person at work. These are ideas of things that you can do about it. Co-working spaces, for example, they're so hot at the moment. It's so in to have co-working spaces. But actually, for somebody who might get very sensory, overwhelmed on a sensory level, a co-working space is hugely disruptive. They might really need a quiet working space. And it's really important to skill up in terms of education to understand what these things are and what we can do to support neurodiversity better. And I think that there are a few neutral ways of asking questions to people that we work with that should be asked. For example, what working style best suits you? Are there any processes or systems going on at work that you would need an explanation for? What mode of communication suits you best? Some people might prefer face-to-face because Teams meetings, for example, or going through technology can feel like a sensory overload. Some people might need shorter meetings. If they have ADHD, it might be really difficult to concentrate for a long time. Or questions like, if we have tasks to do, how is it going to be most optimum for you? How will it be most optimum for you to receive that task list? Some people might really need it written down, and actually if you just stand there and give off the instruction, they're not taking any of it in.
Yep.
So I think it's starting off really open, curious conversations and hearing what works for different people, and also at the same time really introducing education around this area at work, all the way from the top.
Yeah, I guess education is the key thing here, right? Because I guess listening to you there's two things that kind of spring out to me. And firstly is those kind of questions would probably work with someone who has had some form of diagnosis, whereas people who haven't maybe wouldn't necessarily know, okay, what do I need? What they may have in their mind certain things trigger me or make me feel a certain way, but they may not know. And then I guess from the other side, from a kind of, the management of a firm perspective, how do we ensure that we're catering for the entire workforce whilst balancing the whole prospect of time?
Running a business.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's really important. And I'd say a couple of things. The first thing is, I'm going to start where you started, which is somebody who might be more aware of their own neurodiversity might be more apt to answer that question instinctively. However, I do think it is good practice for everybody to be asked these sorts of questions. And if we don't know the answers to how I work best, what mode of communication I prefer, then that's something that you should think about. Yep. Because I think that as we go into work and we enter the workplace, it's important for us to raise awareness for ourselves about our own working styles. Not just individuals who might have a diagnosis or might be neurodivergent. For everybody, we all need to be able to think about those sorts of questions. Because we all have optimum ways of working. And I think that takes us to the second point that you're saying, which is, I always say ultimately, what do businesses want to do? They want to get stuff done on time and in budget. Right, that's what we're aiming for. We want to get results. We want to get the best results on time, in budget. And in order to do that, we need our teams to work together. And in order to work together, we need to bridge gaps of differences. Now, what happens is we tend to feel really comfortable working with people who are similar to us because it's familiar, and humans like familiarity. But when we work with people different, we can start to feel a little bit of a tension or a resistance, because change is really hard for humans. We resist it naturally. And we see that with all forms of diversity. But actually also what we know is that when diverse teams come together and they can bridge those gaps and they can open their ears and listen to each other and open their minds and take other people's ideas and inputs and feedback, the results that they can reach are much, much higher. Because if you have a room of all the same sorts of people sitting around the table, you're going to get the same sorts of results.
Lack of objectivity, right? Everyone's looking through the same lens.
Exactly. But if you have a room of diversity, of diverse individuals that represent diverse ways of thinking, ways of working, backgrounds, contexts, socioeconomic backgrounds as well, education, then what is going to come out of that is going to be something much more innovative, much more exciting. And if we have an inclusive workspace that allows that, ultimately we will not just find a lot more talent, but we will retain it. And I don't think that there's a better way of getting stuff done on time and in budget than that.
Yeah. But then it's almost a work in progress, right? Because I guess the mindset in a lot of, and we'll come to some of the challenges you faced shortly, but I guess the mindset certainly in kind of, if I look at a lot of clients in our space, it's often easier to settle for the devil you know rather than the devil you don't, if that makes sense. So I think going back to the point around education, it's going to take time. And no doubt there'll be various iterations of people implementing schemes or initiatives to work on this, but it's not going to change overnight. It's going to take time for people to A, have their awareness raised, B, recognise the need for education, and then C, have the chance to implement. Is that fair?
Yes, I do agree that there's something there. But if I may bring up, if we go to some of the challenges,
yes,
because I think that's where we're going here, and I know you're going to ask. You wanted to ask about that, anyways. I'm going to ask you. I'm going to put you on the spot. It's nothing too scary, okay? But I'm going to ask you to fold your arms. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you to fold them, and the other way around. You're back where you started.
Yeah. No, can't do it.
Yeah, you're back where you started. You can't do it.
Yeah.
You can. It will take you a long time, and I'm going to make you. But you'll know when you get there because it feels desperately uncomfortable. And anyone who's watching this, I would suggest they do the same. And if you look down, you'll be in the same position over and over again, because we are, as humans, are creatures of habit. We just like to do stuff over and over again in the same way, over and over again. And nothing changes if nothing changes if nothing changes. And we just keep folding them in the same way. And doing it differently feels uncomfortable. Takes a bit of time to do it differently, okay. But that's it. It just feels uncomfortable. And I think that a lot of the challenge that I have found, and if I were to think about the challenge that you've just described, a lot of it is in our heads. It feels scary. We're talking about book a workshop. There are so many around nowadays. Book a workshop. It's an hour. Because actually, even just awareness, just knowing, will help you fold your arms a bit differently. You will just speak to someone a bit differently. You will just phrase what you're going to do a bit differently. If you work in hiring, you will go about your processes just a bit differently now that you understand how different people work. So I think that, yes, it requires something new and some change, which feels really scary because it's uncomfortable. And as humans, we don't like to be uncomfortable. But I understand everyone is so busy, but I don't think this takes tons of time.
No.
I'm not going to ask people to restructure your companies and your work days and your working styles and invest, huge amounts of money into this or time. It's really subtle, but it feels uncomfortable. But growth doesn't come from being comfortable. We all know that. Growth does not come from comfort zones. So I think what it's asking people is not for a huge amount of money, not for a huge amount of time, not for a huge amount of change. It's asking people to go out of their comfort zones and understand something different.
Yep.
Something that's evidence-based,
Yep.
something that is respected, not something crazy, something that exists
Yep.
and that will ultimately bring you better results.
Yep. No, definitely. I mean, I think for me, I'm finding that not necessarily to kind of make light of the progress that certain firms or certain clients have made, but I've found that in a lot of instances it's come from a situation maybe at home or in life generally where people have encountered or had to deal with someone they know, or you know, whether it's a child or whether it's, you know, someone in the family, whatever it may be, having been labelled or diagnosed. Sorry, I keep saying labelled, that's really bad, but diagnosed with some form of neurodiversity. And I think that then carries into the workplace where all of a sudden it's, guys, this is important, we need to address this.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get your thoughts, because I appreciate in speaking to you previously, kind of there is a big overlap with another major topic, which is mental health, right?
Yeah.
Where do you feel, I guess, the two topics overlap? And I guess, are there any points that you would maybe advise clients, for instance, or tips that you would give to people when, you know, considering how to adopt initiatives around neurodiversity to benefit the mental health of the workforce?
It's a really, really important area of overlap. And I suppose the area that we could focus on here is, if you can imagine being in a setting that all day, every day, that feels uncomfortable to you, whether it's on a sensory level, in terms of working styles, your environment, the way that people communicate with you, the way you're expected to work. Being uncomfortable can lead to feeling really anxious or miserable and potentially quite depressed. It can certainly impact a person's mental health and their emotional well-being. And when a person is uncomfortable and is put in uncomfortable positions, or is in a situation where there are expectations on them that are unrealistic, or that they need to go through a tremendous amount of stress in order to comply, that can impact a person's mental health. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that's important to flag is that if an individual has gone through a period of time of feeling misunderstood, so that they don't understand themselves, or other people don't understand them, they don't know why they're like this, they don't know why they can't concentrate, or that they communicate differently to other people, or why they really need high-level structure, or why they get very overwhelmed by the underground, or whatever it might be. A person that feels misunderstood for a very long period of time as well, that also can impact a person's mental health. It can impact a person's confidence, a person's self-esteem, which will have a knock-on effect on their performance, which then has a follow-on knock-on effect on their confidence, and it's a vicious cycle. So I'd say these are two really important areas to think about in terms of mental health, and how we can support that. And this is not just for neurodiversity, this is with all forms of diversity, of not being understood or being in a situation that makes you feel uncomfortable. Really, the way to be sensitive to that and to try to enhance mental health and work on minimizing these issues is to try to breed a more inclusive workspace where people do feel more comfortable with the expectations that are put upon them in the settings that they are in. And I'm not talking about expectations in terms of output. I'm not saying that people need to perform less. So I'm not suggesting here that people need to do less and perform less. I'm talking about things like maybe they need a quiet room instead of a noisy room. Or maybe once they've come off the underground, because it is a bit of a sensory overload, they just need 10 minutes downtime before they start their day.
Right.
So don't jump on them as soon as they walk in. Very small things. I think that just being aware and mindful of those things, and again, taking it back to education, I think can really help with that. But also there's a responsibility on individuals, we're talking to adults here at the end of the day, that if they are going through that themselves and they're struggling on that journey, that they should go and seek appropriate help and investigate and look into that.
Yep. And sorry, just to lead on from that, is that something that you feel you mentioned as individuals to obviously you look out for signs of things that are bothering you or maybe playing on your mind or affecting you in a certain way and seek appropriate help? Do you feel that we need to get to a point where, as businesses, companies are also offering that to employees, where it's kind of, hey, this is something we are aware of and we support you in seeking help if you, because I'm guessing that's not widespread currently, right? It's almost kind of, hey, if there's a problem, go and deal with it in your lunch break or go and speak to someone.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between the company dealing with it and the company supporting an individual to address it. And I think it's not a company's responsibility to deal with the issue because they're not professionals in this area. It needs to go over to people that are trained to deal with this. But I do think that it's the responsibility, not just the responsibility, I think it will really help the companies if they support that process, because then they will be able to work better with that individual and help optimize that individual's potential and performance. So I think it's a process they can support. But a lot of companies do or have always and are doing increasingly providing interventions for particular forms of neurodiversity. So I think we will find that most HR departments, for example, will have some tools and resources for people who are dyslexic, whether it's auto dictation, so it doesn't have to be typed up, color reading filters and these sorts of things. It's just less maybe known about, less widespread. But I do think that as time passes, companies will want to start thinking increasingly about what interventions they can put in place for individuals that arrive with diagnoses. And I think that's because, I suppose this takes us onto another area I know we're interested in discussing, with generational gaps, because a lot of the younger generations are arriving at work with more knowledge, understanding and diagnoses around neurodiversity, and they're used to support and understanding. So there's going to be quite a big conversation, I think, coming up over the next few years for companies of how do we bridge this gap from someone that's coming from university with a diagnosis who's used to a lot of support into the workplace where we just want to kind of get the job done. So I think it's another area for conversation to think about.
And with the generational issue, I guess, it's even things like language, right? Things, someone of an elder generation, for example, is used to using certain words without necessarily understanding the damage or the hurt that it could cause, because it's not their fault. They're from a different time where saying certain things didn't mean what it means today. Whereas I guess the younger generation are almost growing up with this, right? So are more aware. Let's tap into your knowledge and your experiences so far, and let's kind of bring it into the work that you're doing with corporate clients. What does the future, in your perspective, how do we get to a place where firms are implementing initiatives to educate the workforce and themselves on how best to support this? And I guess just if you're able to share a few pointers on how firms can begin to start taking, getting measures in place to kind of show a willingness to support people that may be neurodiverse.
It's a really important area to think about. I think, as you said earlier, what is starting to happen within this industry is that there are individuals at work who have personal encounters with neurodiversity, neurodivergent individuals, or that they have received perhaps adult diagnoses, which are also becoming increasingly popular for things like ADHD in particular. And they are pushing forward an agenda at work to raise awareness around it, which is admirable and is making change. I think, though, there is a responsibility on companies to not just be reactive and to not just provide the education around personal stories and wait for the emotional agenda to be pushed forward. Not emotional agenda, the agenda to be pushed forward from an emotional place and from a personal place. I think companies should be proactive in saying, these are all the forms of diversity that we are proactive about, and neurodiversity needs to be added to that list if it isn't there already. It so happens I also think that age and generational diversity also should be added, because I just think it will help get much better results out of young people, which neuro people struggle with. But I think neurodiversity needs to be added there, and I think that at the very least, a workshop, an informative workshop explaining this is what it is, this is how you talk about it, this is how you ask someone about it if you're concerned. I think at the very least that should be part of a just standard rollout.
Yeah. And that overlaps with my next question, which was to ask you your own personal thoughts on how we can, I guess, influence the narrative around neurodiversity, and all types of diversity within the corporate world. What are your thoughts on, I think we've talked about education, we've talked about language, we've talked about the need to be supportive and empathetic. Are there any other factors that you think, whether it's a HR director in a firm or a managing partner in a firm that's starting to think about these things? How would you advise someone in that position that's starting to think about a strategy around this?
I think there are a couple of things. I'll add to that list. I think the list definitely has some really good pointers of where to start. I'll also add on curiosity. I think that there's something really powerful about humble curiosity. Not presuming I know what this is and I know what to do, but to be curious to the people that are working around you, whether it's through surveys, some reverse coaching, reverse mentoring, and asking, what would you like to see here? What would be helpful for you? What do you think we should have? And is there anyone in the company that does want to talk about personal experiences? And to really listen to the neurologically diverse individuals that already work, which is everyone within that company, and to find out from them how to pitch this education, how to target the interventions that you're going to put in place. I think that really brings it onto the agenda. And I would say as well, thinking about actually coaching, and if there are individuals in the company that are neurodivergent, with or without diagnosis, but that feel they could do with some coaching in terms of their working style and their learning style. I know I'm doing an increasing amount of coaching, and being able to have that opportunity to get some specialist support on how to bridge the gap from, let's say, university into the workplace, or for somebody more experienced to think, okay, I understand this is how I work, but I still don't know how best to manage this. And so to get some specialist guidance on it and to have that available within a company, I also think is really significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I know we could probably spend a lot more longer talking about this. Just before we wrap things up, firstly, thank you for your time. Secondly, just to let our listeners know that I guess from your perspective, you cover, you're not just advising clients, but you are also coaching individuals. So if it's okay, we will include the link to your website on the body of the podcast, so that people can access and get in contact if they need to. But thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's such an important conversation, and thank you for doing your part in raising awareness around it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you.